by definition, diseases or a disease process is something that is detrimental to the health of an organism. So natural selection obviously works to limit and minimize diseases, and there will be selection for individuals that are more resistant to pathogens or that are less susceptible to injuries, if we want to think about injury, at least if it's a common type of injury that occurs all the time. It might be profitable to think about that as again, by a very general definition, a type of a disease. But if individuals are more immune to those sorts of injuries, they will do better, and eventually we get populations that are healthier and healthier. Often there's a large amount of coevolution that is going on, right? So we talked about this, how when there is a pathogen in a host, particularly if that pathogen can only infect and make a living in that one host, that there is a huge amount of coevolution and even co-speciation that can occur. Okay, so there are three main reasons why we still see diseases and why diseases are a problem, and we could list many others other than this, but let's talk about these three. Number one, that as environments change, that there's time necessary for a selective response. Now, in humans, we have used our understanding of disease processes and modern technology to alleviate and change many of the trajectories of evolution of our immunity. But let's look at HIV as an example for this one. So HIV is a relatively new infection in humans, and initially it was nearly 100% fatal. People would get sick, their immune system would be compromised, they would develop cancers and other things because their immune system was no longer functioning correctly, pneumonia, and they would die. And originally it looked like everybody was very, very susceptible. Now we know that there are some rare individuals that are resistant or potentially even completely immune to the HIV, the virus that causes AIDS, right? The human immunodeficiency virus. And so it's hard to understand exactly, ahead of time, what percentage of the population may be immune. It might be a fairly significant percent. It might only be a very, very minor percent. But for the vast majority of diseases, there is some number of people who are not susceptible, or at least are get a much less severe case. So if the disease is allowed to run rampant, if we don't have any way to intervene, then you're going to have lots and lots of people die, but the leftover individuals are the ones that are going to be resistant or that are slightly better at overcoming. And so the next generation will have a much lower incidence of virulence. They may still have the infection, but they may no longer suffer from it. It may not be as severe. But that can take time. It takes time for brand new mutations, natural selection, genetic drift, all of these things that we've been talking about throughout evolution to actually have a major impact on populations and drive them. But eventually, populations will change if there is a disease process that is detrimental to fitness. Okay, so that's just the way natural selection works. Now, also there are limitations to what can be done. And this can be limitations based on the genetic background, but also just simply physical limitations. We're going to look at an example here with choking in humans, where there are just certain things that are impossible to do or are very difficult, and so it might take many, many thousands of generations before we have the types of mutations that are going to allow a population to overcome and not be as impacted as severely for a disease. So we're going to look at choking, but let's talk a little bit about broken bones like knees in humans. Now, knees are a notorious injury, especially in athletes, but in everyday regular people too. The knees are prone to injury. Now, we do have injury to all sorts of joints, but think about it, ankle injuries. Ankle injuries are still somewhat common, but much less common, at least much less catastrophic than knee injuries. Okay, and you can look at any other joints, right? So why don't we hear all the time about elbow injuries, right? Pretty much the only time where it's a very common injury is in pitchers, right, that are putting tons and tons of stress on that. But In humans, the knee is the forelimb, right, our arm equivalent of the elbow. But we have way, way fewer elbow injuries than we do knee injuries. And of course, the reason for this is obvious. There's much more physical pressure on our knees, and this has to do with our transition to bipedalism, right? We walk on two legs, all of our entire weight is there. It's got to be up and down with less give in it than organisms that are going around on four legs. And so that is just something that, although they are reinforced and better, they're still much weaker based on the purpose that they serve than they really probably ought to be, ideally at least. And so you look at dogs or cats or other organisms, they have way fewer knee problems because they don't have those same physical constraints that are imposed because they are still quadrupedal instead of bipedal. And lastly, evolution doesn't really care about individual long-term survival as long as they can reproduce. So if you have injuries but it doesn't overall impact your ability to reproduce, it's not a big deal. Or if you have diseases, and this is especially why they're very common, there are lots of diseases of old age, right? Because if you've done most of your reproducing, then a disease that comes in your old age is not going to have a major impact on your fitness. And in the next unit, we'll look at senescence, which is the study of aging, which you can kind of think of as a disease process, or at least an accumulation of physiological issues that might be analogous to a disease process. So let's look at two things that really are not diseases in and of themselves, but are related to diseases or related at least to physiological processes that can be detrimental. Fever is an interesting one. Fever is a condition that can be initiated either metabolically, like in mammals, or can actually be initiated behaviorally through sitting out in the sun longer. So lizards actually have an analogous feature to mammalian fever. Now, mammalian fever, your body does it on your own. You don't need to do anything active, right? But in lizards, when they are sick, they will sit out in the sun longer and raise their body temperature above where they normally would. Now, the idea is that at these elevated temperatures, the bacteria or virus that is infecting your body is much less able to reproduce. They can't survive as well. And so it gives your immune system or your body a chance to catch up and eliminate that pathogen. But it's also risky because if you raise your core body temperature too high, then you're going to have some serious physiological problems and eventually even cell death, right? So much above 105, 106 in humans, and it's, at least for very long, that's not survivable because there's so much cellular damage that occurs, okay? And so fever is a trade-off. And overall, it's a good thing, right? Because more often than not, it helps us, which is why it's been selected for and why organisms exhibit this trait. But there is a downside to it, and it can be a very serious thing. Another very interesting one in humans is the choking process. And this, again, comes back to this idea of trade-offs. Humans are much more prone to choking. Again, not really kind of what you would think of as your classic standard disease, but it's a physiological limitation, a detriment. So it's useful to think about it in the same kind of light as we think about diseases. And so dogs, cats, other organisms have very few choking problems. They have a epiglottis that forms very, very tight seal up against their palate. And so it's very easy to shut off your pharynx, right, the airway, from your esophagus, the food and liquid, getting food and liquid down into your stomach. And so it's much easier. Now in humans, our soft palate and our epiglottis, the epiglottis is like the little trap door that closes the pharynx so that we don't choke. But those are very, very separated, so we have a much less firm connection for that epiglottis, and it's much easier to get liquid down the wrong tube, and we choke a little bit. Of course, steak gets stuck in there, that's a little bit different. But choking is a very common thing in humans. Now, it's not a major issue. Occasionally, people will die. It can be tragic in certain cases, but it's a fairly minor overall cause of death. And so the trade-off in humans was that we would choke a little bit more frequently, kind of an inconvenience, a little bit of a risk, but it expanded our range, our vocal range. so that we can make all sorts of different sounds because of the position of our soft palate in the back of our throat. Many sounds are made there, and so our range of sounds is in part due to that ability. So the trade-off was, you can choke a little bit more often, but we have a range of sounds, better way to communicate, more variety and diversity there. And that seems to be a very important thing in the early origin of humans, and so we have developed that. Now let's look at some infectious disease issues. We've talked a little bit already about the different levels of the novel coronavirus, but you need to understand, hopefully you already got this from our previous coevolution discussion, that there is a strong coevolutionary arms race, so to speak, that's going on with hosts and their pathogens, where hosts will evolve through natural selection as a population more and more resistance to pathogens. Pathogens then need to evolve if they are going to maintain and stay viable in that population. And so we get more virulence, a host responds and becomes more resistant, and then the virus becomes more virulent. Now, it's important for you guys to understand what the very best strategy is for an infectious disease. And really there's this kind of sweet spot, or maybe you can think of it like the Goldilocks zone. Not too virulent and not avirulent, right? And so virulence basically refers to how severe are the symptoms. And if a virus is so severe that it kills the hosts before they have the chance to pass it on, that's not going to be a long-term successful strategy. And so viruses like that will sometimes rage through a population, but they very rarely will maintain stable unless the host is able to respond. And then, of course, they become less virulent as the host population evolves. So a virus that is avirulent, that doesn't cause any disease processes at all, is also not very successful because it might get into a host, infect them, but if your nose isn't running and sneezing and diarrhea and all these great things that come around with different infectious diseases, those are essentially things that the virus or bacteria does to increase the chances of transmission. So the sweet spot, the best strategy for infectious disease is to make your host sick a little bit, right? But not enough to kill it. That way that your host can go around, transmit, and we don't have the high levels of virulence. So when pathogens have evolved for a long period of time in a population, they usually reach this kind of balance point. And there can be changes. If resistance in the host increases, then virulence, and there will be changes in the pathogen to compensate for that, and back and forth. Now, the mammalian immune system is very interesting. The mammalian immune system will recognize many, many different types of invaders. They will fight off the infection, but in addition, they will keep around a reminder of that infection in the form of antibodies, kind of like a little antibody library. And so for many diseases, if you're exposed to it once, you will then be immune, maybe not forever, but maybe forever, but you'll be immune to that. And this is how we actually, this is what vaccines do, right? We inject a small amount of something that is similar enough to the virus, but not dangerous. It's a safe version. Your body recognizes it, launches this counterattack, and then keeps a record on file in the form of an antibody of that challenge, that disease. And so when the real disease comes around, your body immediately recognizes it and fights it off, and you don't get sick. You don't really see any symptoms. So your immune system works by both actively fighting it off and then keeping a record for later. Now, there's many more complex details of the immune system, but we're not going to be going over those for this system. Okay. Now, with that said then, why does our immune system have trouble with viruses, particularly certain viruses? So HIV is a great example. Influenza is another example where you get a shot for influenza, maybe a really good match for the types of strains that are around that year. It might not be such a great match. Some years they get it better than others, but usually it's pretty good at allowing us to develop resistance to these viruses before we're actually exposed to them. So why do you have to get a flu shot every year? Why aren't you immune after one? And the reason is many viruses have evolved a strategy, right? It's been helpful, and so it's been selected for, but the strategy is for hyperdiversity. And so enough mutations occur that when a different strain of flu comes around next year or 2 or 3 years later, your body does not recognize it. It has to go through that whole process and make a brand new antibody for the new strain of flu. And the idea with vaccines, and what they work very hard to do, is to identify potentially common strains in the next year and then include those. And usually there are several strains that are included in each year's vaccine. And some years they're good at projecting what are going to be the strains that are common and going to be a problem, and other times they're not as good. But generally it works fairly well. Now, inevitably, in a host pathogen relationship, there are going to be some fairly strong selection. And bacteria and viruses are kind of the poster children, if you will, the best example of this really, really strong selection, where they might make millions or billions of offspring and only have 1 or 2 survive. That process is called clonal selection, right? Where we're making copies. Occasionally there are changes and differences. Many of them die out. But if one is very, very useful, it will then be selected for, and eventually we end up with a virus or bacteria that is very, very good at living in organisms. And there's a type of clonal selection that is also going on in our immune system, where we are selecting for the white blood cells or the antibodies that will recognize those invaders. So we get clonal selection on both sides. Clonal selection is really good at sorting through a vast majority of different items, right? Whether it's helper T cells in your immune system, or whether it is viruses, selecting which one is going to survive and do best because that's the one that is able to make a living, or that's the one that is needed to fight off the virus. We select for it, and we end up with a rapid expansion again, where every single individual is now descended from that one successful clone that we started with. Okay? So clonal selection is a very fast and very dramatic evolutionary process. Okay? So let's look at this response of viruses and bacteria to their host's resistance. Now realize that we've changed the dynamic of this in the human species with our modern vaccines, with modern treatments and intervention. But in the past, there were basically 2 strategies that worked for viruses that became established in the human population. Number 1 is on the right here, and we've already talked about it. So that's B, the human influenza virus. There are other viruses that are like this, where rates of evolution are so high in that virus that the host immune system basically has to, every year or every new exposure, create a brand new antibody. So you get sick, you pass it on, and then maybe after 2 or 3 weeks of feeling crummy, then you're better. But the flu virus has evolved this strategy where it continuously infects the same hosts over and over and over again. So if we make a phylogeny of the influenza virus, we can see a trend. And in this phylogeny, the ones in the top here are the ones that are older. So this might be going back 30 years. We say like in 1990, right? We have these strains, and we get up into the 2000s, the 2010s. There would be a very clear pattern. And this is because the population's immunity is driving new and new strains that are related to the most recent strain. And so we'd say older viruses, mid-viruses, and the newer ones infecting individuals today are up here. So very clear, obvious evolutionary strain and push on that virus. Now, there's another strategy that can also be successful, and measles and other childhood diseases like chickenpox have evolved this strategy. These are viruses that do not have the ability, they have not evolved the ability to continually mutate to get around host immunity. So that means if you're exposed to them once, you're essentially immune. And these are the ones that's easiest to make a vaccine for. You can get one vaccine, maybe a booster later on in life, or a couple of years later, and you are completely immune your entire life. You'll never get that disease. So how do these diseases survive if they're getting into populations and then people are immune? Well, the way that they survive is by infecting naive individuals. Those are individuals who have never exposed to them, and mostly that means young children. who have never had the measles. It can also mean that we get these kind of outbreaks where it will get into an area where there has not been an outbreak for a generation and nobody is resistant because no one was exposed to it. Today we're seeing a little bit of that also because diseases that were pushed back and were being very, very uncommon because of vaccines are now coming back as people choose to not vaccinate their children. And so we can get these little hot spots popping back up because those are now a fresh, ready population of naive hosts. Now the phylogeny for these pathogens that go through a process where they're only infecting naive hosts and that confers lifelong immunity, they look much less patterned. And so we might have old viruses here and in the middle from 30 years ago a new one. So it's basically spread all around and there's no clear pattern with the date of the infection and the relationships of the viruses. Okay, we're going to finish up looking at host pathogens, talking about one that's very important as this COVID-19 pandemic has developed, and that is zoonotic transmission. Now, the same root word here for zoology or zoo, right, is animals. Zoonotic transmission is a pathogen that is transmitted to humans by a different species. And there's actually an incredibly long list of zoonotic diseases. This is one I just Googled and looked up. This is in United Kingdom. And notice we're only down, these are alphabetical, we're only down through about a third of the examples here, down to Giardia. But there are dozens and dozens of zoonotic transmitted diseases. COVID-19 is just the most recent. Ebola, SARS, going back, MERS, all of these diseases, many of them are named after the reservoir from which the virus comes. So for instance, you have heard of avian flu or swine flu. Those are zoonotic flu strains that were able to jump from a pig population to a human population or a bird population to a human population. Now, why are zoonotic diseases so much more virulent than other ones? And we can really answer this in two ways. Number one, they're really not more virulent. In fact, the vast majority of them are avirulent in humans or can't even be transmitted to humans. But we don't worry about those. We don't see them. They're not on our radar. So your cat might be carrying 5 or 6 different viruses, but if none of them can jump in and get you sick, or if they jump into you and you're not sick at all, it grows in your cells for a little while but doesn't make you sick, we don't worry about it, and it's not a problem. So zoonotic diseases, in fact, are usually, if we're going to take all of them, are either avirulent or very, very lightly virulent. But every once in a while, we have one of them that is incredibly dangerous. And the reason why we get those every once in a while is because they have adapted to a different host's immune system. So we're still looking at this, but the general idea, the data seems to suggest the closest relative of the current COVID-19 virus, the closest relative is a virus that is common in bats. And so in bats, which is the reservoir population, it probably is maybe, just like a small common cold. It's probably evolved to be somewhere in that mid-range because that's usually what happens. And it makes the bats a little bit sick. They have symptoms, they pass it on, it does well, it kind of goes through its normal viral life cycle. But when it jumps into humans, all bets are off. It's most likely not going to be virulent, but if it is, it can be very, very serious because we don't have this long history of coevolution with the disease. And so some of our most dangerous, kind of scariest diseases, Ebola, anthrax, now this COVID-19, are zoonotic transmissions. And eventually the population will evolve, become more resistant, and if it stays in the population, that zoonotic transmission will now just become a regular disease with a zoonotic history that was where it originated, but will become, fairly innocuous. Some of them are more dangerous than others, but they evolve to become less virulent. But when they first jump over from the other population, if they are infectious and if they cause a disease, sometimes it will be very, very severe. And with this most recent COVID-19 pandemic, we're seeing the
outcome of that.